Welcome to another thrilling historical Western romance audiobook, The Cowboy's Reckoning. If you are new to our channel, we invite you to subscribe and turn on the notification bell to stay updated with our daily releases of captivating historical Western romance stories. And if you enjoy our content, don't forget to leave a like to show your support. For our loyal listeners, welcome back. Excited to have you here again. Shall we begin? Act 1. Arrivals in Red Mesa. The Wyoming sky unfurled like a painter's canvas, a breathtaking medley of soft purples melting into streaks of amber and rose. The rising sun cast golden light over the land, touching the dry grass and rolling hills with a quiet reverence. A lone hawk drifted overhead, its wings outstretched, scanning the wide-open plains below. Evelyn Evie Hartley pressed her forehead against the rattling window of the stagecoach, watching the landscape shift from golden pastures to a harsher, rock-strewn terrain. She tried to quell the nerves twisting in her belly, reminding herself that this was a fresh start. A home? A husband waiting at the end of the road. Thomas McAllister had written of prosperity, of a plot of land sturdy enough to withstand Wyoming's fickle temperament, of a simple but comfortable home where they could build a life together. The words in his letters had painted pictures of a man eager to share a future, a man ready to welcome her with open arms. She smoothed a hand over her traveling dress, a deep brown calico with tiny blue flowers embroidered near the cuffs. Not the finest garment, but sturdy, practical. Everything a frontier wife ought to be. And yet, beneath her gloved fingers, her heart pounded in a steady rhythm of anticipation and uncertainty. The driver, a broad-shouldered man with a sun-darkened face, spit a stream of tobacco over the side of the rig before glancing down at her. "Red Mesa ain't much to look at," he muttered, voice as dry as the dust rising from the wheels. "Ain't much kindness to be found in it, neither." Evie lifted her chin. "A town is only as good as the people who live in it." He let out a grunt, adjusting his grip on the reins. "Then I hope you're a lucky woman, miss. 'Cause luck's what you'll need out here." The words unsettled her more than she cared to admit. Her fingers tightened around the small, leather-bound journal in her lap, the same one that held Thomas's letters, neatly folded, as if preserving his words would somehow solidify his presence. Another jolt of the stagecoach sent her teeth clamping down against the inside of her cheek. She had dreamed of this moment for months, of stepping onto Wyoming soil with a heart full of hope. But now, with the driver's words hanging heavy in the air, she couldn't shake the feeling that something waited for her in Red Mesa. Something that had nothing to do with the dreams she had so carefully constructed. The stagecoach rattled to a halt in the heart of Red Mesa, sending a thick cloud of dust swirling into the dry morning air. Evie pressed a gloved hand to her chest, willing her breath to steady. This was it. The place where her new life would begin. The door creaked open, and she gathered her skirts before stepping down onto the packed dirt road. Her boots met the ground with a solid thud, sending another puff of dust into the folds of her hem. The sun glared down, relentless and unyielding, its golden light exposing every flaw in the weary town before her. Wooden storefronts lined the street, their paint long since bleached by the elements. Many of the signs creaked on rusty chains, their letters faded, the wood splintering at the edges. The general store had a warped front step, a reminder that few things out here stood the test of time without battle scars. Across the way, a saloon with a sagging roof boasted a swinging door that never seemed to still, its frame worn smooth from years of rowdy patrons pushing through. A gust of wind swept down the street, stirring the dust into a lazy dance before settling over the porches and cracked sidewalks. It clung to everything: the storefronts, the horses tied outside the livery, the edges of her skirt. The air itself felt thick with it, dry enough to parch her throat with every breath. Evie squared her shoulders and took a step forward, only to catch movement from the corner of her eye. A handful of townsfolk lingered near the storefronts, their gazes flicking toward her, cautious and assessing. A woman in a gingham dress whispered something to the man beside her, and though Evie couldn't hear the words, she saw the way his lips pressed into a thin line. A man standing outside the general store dipped his hat in greeting, though his expression carried more curiosity than warmth. A pair of children peeked at her from behind a barrel, their wide eyes round with interest, before their mother shooed them away with a gentle hand. She had expected to feel out of place at first. A stranger arriving in a small town would always turn a few heads. But there was something else in their looks, something that made her stomach tighten. It wasn't just curiosity, it was knowing. A lump formed in her throat. She had hoped to step into this town with a fresh start, to be received as Thomas McAllister's bride-to-be. Instead, these people watched her as if she was stepping into the middle of a story that had already begun, one that carried a sorrowful weight she hadn't been prepared for. Brushing off the unease, she lifted her chin and pressed forward. She wouldn't let wary glances shake her resolve. Just ahead, the modest boarding house stood at the end of the street, its sign reading Mrs. Tilley's lodging in faded paint. The structure looked sturdier than most, though the shutters hung at odd angles and the rocking chair on the porch sat lopsided. It would do. With her carpet bag clutched tightly in one hand, Evie took her first true step into Red Mesa, uncertain of what lay ahead but determined to face it all the same. The bell above the general store's door jingled as Evie stepped inside, the sound small and cheery, at odds with the heavy weight in her chest. The scent of dry goods, pipe tobacco, and sun-warmed wood filled the air, mingling with the faintest trace of flour dust that had settled over the counter. She adjusted her grip on her carpet bag, scanning the shelves stacked with sacks of beans, bolts of fabric, and tins of coffee. It was a modest store, the kind that served as the heart of a town like Red Mesa, where folks lingered not just to buy what they needed but to catch up on the latest news. The clerk behind the counter, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and nervous hands, stiffened at the sight of her. He swallowed hard, the motion exaggerated by the sharp bob of his Adam's apple. "Miss Hartley?" His voice wavered just enough to send a prickle of unease up her spine. "Yes," she answered, smoothing her skirts to mask the tremor in her fingers. "I was hoping to ask after Thomas McAllister. I arrived on this morning's stage." A long silence stretched between them. The clerk opened his mouth, then shut it again, his gaze darting to the wooden floor as if searching for words among the knotted planks. His fingers drummed once against the countertop before he cleared his throat. I'm sorry, miss?" He exhaled, his chest rising and falling in a way that made her own breath catch. "Tommy's gone." The words didn't make sense. They floated in the air, disconnected from reality, like letters on a page that refused to form a coherent sentence. "Gone?" she echoed, barely aware that she had spoken aloud. The clerk's face turned a shade paler. He passed. Found dead 3 days ago." He hesitated. Some say it weren't natural. Her heart slammed against her ribs. No, that couldn't be right. The room blurred at the edges, the wooden counter and shelves pressing in on her. A sharp rush of air filled her lungs, but it wasn't enough. It couldn't be enough, because Tommy was waiting for her. Tommy had written to her just weeks ago, promising a new life, a home of their own, a place where she could belong. A tremor worked through her fingers as she clutched the strap of her bag, holding on to something solid while the ground beneath her tilted. "That can't be," she whispered. "There must be some mistake." The clerk shook his head, sorrow flickering in his gaze. "I wish that was so, miss. I surely do." Her mind reeled backward, grasping at the memories of the man she had only known through ink and paper, but had felt connected to all the same. Tommy's first letter had been warm, steady, full of the kind of earnest hope that made a person believe in the goodness of life. "I know the frontier can be harsh, but it ain't all dust and hardship, Evie. It's a place where a man can build something of his own, where a woman can find a home, where dreams stretch as wide as the land itself." The next had been laced with humor, a wit she had grown fond of even before she saw his handwriting scrawl across the pages. "I reckon I'm no poet, but I figure I'm honest, and I'll always do right by you. I hope that's enough, Miss Hartley." I hope you'll give me the chance to prove it. And his last had spoken of excitement, of preparations, of the future they would build. I'll be waiting at the stage when you arrive. You'll know me easy, I'll be the fella looking like he just won the biggest prize this side of the Mississippi. A sound caught in her throat, something raw and broken, but she swallowed it down. She would not cry here. Not in front of the clerk, not in front of the handful of townsfolk milling near the shelves, their wary gazes darting in her direction. She forced herself to stand tall, though her insides felt hollowed out, scooped clean like a melon left to dry in the sun. Where? Her voice felt foreign to her own ears. Where is he buried? The clerk hesitated before nodding toward the window. The cemetery's just past the ridge north of town. You'll find him there. A long breath shuddered through her chest. She gave a nod, stiff and automatic, then turned and walked out of the store without another word. The bell above the door rang again, a cheerful chime that felt cruel in its indifference. Stepping onto the street, she tilted her chin toward the sun, letting the heat wash over her, grounding her in something tangible. Tommy was gone. The dream she had held so tightly, the future she had clung to, had vanished like smoke in the wind. And yet the dust beneath her feet told her she was still here. The town of Red Mesa had taken the man she was supposed to marry, but it hadn't taken her. Not yet. She might have come here for Tommy, but something told her she would be staying for another reason entirely. The sun hung low over Red Mesa, stretching shadows long and thin across the dusty street. Evie barely registered the warmth on her skin as she stepped away from the general store, her mind still struggling to grasp the reality of what she had just learned. Tommy was gone. The man she had crossed half the country to marry lay buried in a plot of land she had never seen, in a town where no one knew her name. She clutched the handle of her carpetbag, knuckles pressing white. A deep breath pulled in the scent of sun-baked earth and horses, but it did little to settle the ache in her chest. The steps carried her forward, but she had no clear destination. It felt wrong to go back to the boarding house, to sit in a quiet room with nothing but the weight of grief pressing down on her. The town was awake, voices spilling from the open doorway of the saloon, boots scuffing along the walkways. Red Mesa moved as if nothing had happened, as if her world hadn't cracked in two the moment the clerk uttered those awful words. She walked aimlessly, thoughts tangled in the past, until a voice cut through the din of town life. Shame about Tommy. The words snagged in her mind, sharp and pointed. Evie stilled, ears straining toward the conversation drifting from the saloon's front porch. Two men leaned against the railing, their voices low, but not so low she couldn't hear. Ain't right if you ask me, one of them continued. He was broad-shouldered, wearing a dusty brown vest over a sweat-stained shirt, his hat tipped just enough to keep the sun out of his eyes. Fella knew how to handle himself. Hard to believe he just up and died. More'n just hard to believe. The other man said, his fingers working a matchstick between his teeth. He was thinner, older, his grey-streaked beard patchy in places. Ain't natural, that's for sure. Evie's stomach twisted. She took a careful step closer, feet nearly silent against the dirt-packed ground. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice steadier than she expected. The older man stiffened at her intrusion, his gaze sliding toward her. The matchstick stilled between his teeth. "Beg pardon, miss. I heard what you said." She lifted her chin, though her insides felt raw and shaken. "You don't believe Tommy's death was natural?" The two men exchanged glances. The younger one, the broad-shouldered one, looked as if he'd rather be anywhere else. The older one, however, studied her for a long moment before letting out a slow sigh. "Don't mean no disrespect, miss," he said, shifting his weight against the post. "But it's a bad thing to go poking around in trouble." She squared her shoulders. "I didn't ask if it was trouble. I asked what you meant." A long silence stretched between them, thick as the summer heat. The younger man was the first to break it. Some folks say he was asking questions he shouldn't have been. He pulled his hat lower over his eyes, as if that might shield him from her scrutiny. About land, water rights. Something bigger than him. The older man huffed. He got himself tangled in something, that much is true. And look where it landed him. He gave her a pointed look, as if urging her to take the warning for what it was. Some folks don't take kindly to a man sniffing where he don't belong. Evie swallowed hard. She had never known Tommy to be reckless, not from the letters he sent. He had written of honesty, of hard work, of a future built on something solid. But these men made it sound like he had stepped into a pit of vipers, and she could feel their unspoken words curling through the air between them. They weren't saying he had died. They were saying he had been silenced. Her fingers tightened around her carpet bag, the stiff leather cool against her palm. Grief coiled deep, but it no longer burned as helpless sorrow. It sharpened into something harder, something that curled in her belly like the slow heat of embers waiting for the right wind to fan them into fire. She had come to Red Mesa to be Tommy's bride. Now she would stay to find out why he had died. The wind had picked up by the time Evie reached the cemetery, carrying the dry scent of sagebrush and the whisper of dust over the quiet hillside. The path that led from town wound past brittle grass and scattered rocks, the land stretching wide and open beneath the golden hues of a fading afternoon. She tightened her shawl around her shoulders, though the wind's bite had little to do with the chill crawling up her spine. The cemetery wasn't much just a patch of land where the earth had been split and stitched back together too many times. A weathered wooden fence, its slats uneven and leaning, framed the graves, marking them with a dignity time hadn't quite managed to strip away. Evie's steps slowed as she passed the first few headstones, her heart pressing heavy against her ribs. The names engraved in the stone belonged to strangers, but their stories weren't so different from Tommy's lives cut short, dreams left unfinished. She hadn't been sure what she expected to feel when she stood at his grave. Maybe she had hoped for some sense of closeness, a whisper of his presence in the stillness of the afternoon. Instead, all she felt was the hollowness of loss, the cruel finality of the simple wooden cross that marked where he had been laid to rest. Her fingers brushed the carved letters of his name, Thomas Tommy McAllister. 1862, 1885, a lump rose in her throat. She had imagined so much long nights spent beside a warm fire, mornings greeted with shared smiles, a life built with care and patience. But all of that had been buried with him, leaving her with nothing but a handful of letters, and the ache of what would never be. She let out a shuddering breath, the weight of it settling deep in her chest. "You shouldn't be here." The deep, measured voice cut through the stillness, sending a start through her. Evie turned, her breath catching at the sight of the man standing a few yards away. He was taller than Tommy had been, with a build carved from hard labor. Broad shoulders, strong arms, a frame that seemed made for carrying burdens no one else dared to touch. The wind teased at his dark brown hair, the unruly strands nearly brushing his collar, but it was his eyes that held her still blue-gray, sharp as a blade, yet shadowed with something deeper. Grief. It wasn't loud, wasn't showy. It was the kind that settled into a man's bones, the kind he carried with him whether he wanted to or not. Caleb McAllister. Even if she hadn't known Tommy had an older brother, she would have recognized him. The resemblance was there, tucked into the angles of his face, in the strength of his jaw. But where Tommy's letters had been full of warmth and light, Caleb was all storm clouds and silence. Evie swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his gaze. I had to come. His expression didn't change. If anything, his jaw tightened, as though her presence here was some sort of offense he couldn't put into words. "There's no reason for you to linger," he said, shifting his gaze toward Tommy's grave. His voice was steady, but she didn't miss the raw edge to it. "There's nothing left for you here." The words stung, though she wasn't sure why. Maybe because they were too close to the ones she had been trying to push aside since she arrived. She squared her shoulders. "I don't believe that." Caleb let out a slow breath, his gaze dragging back to hers. He studied her then, his eyes moving over her with quiet calculation, not in a way that felt unkind, but as if he were trying to place her, trying to decide whether she belonged in whatever came next. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind whistled through the dry grass, rattling the loose slats of the fence, but neither moved. Finally, he exhaled, shaking his head. "You don't know this place." "You don't know what kind of trouble I know. Tommy's dead," she interrupted, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. "I know people are saying it wasn't natural." His eyes darkened. "I know he wouldn't have written me the way he did if he thought he was in danger," she continued. "And I know I didn't come all this way to leave without answers." Caleb stared at her for a long beat, then glanced away, his jaw shifting as if he were grinding back words he didn't want to say. When he finally looked at her again, something had changed, not enough to call it trust, not even close. But maybe, just maybe, a sliver of recognition. You shouldn't go asking questions you don't want the answers to. Evie lifted her chin. "Then I guess I'll just have to be careful where I ask them." For the first time, something almost like amusement passed through his gaze, but it was gone just as quickly. He let out a breath, long and slow, before giving a small shake of his head. Without another word, he turned, stepping away from the grave and walking toward the gate. Evie watched him go, something unfamiliar twisting in her stomach. She had thought she was alone in this. Maybe she wasn't. The wind had settled some by the time Evie caught up to Caleb, though the dry heat still pressed against her skin, thick and unrelenting. He hadn't gone far. Just past the cemetery gate, he stood near the edge of the trail, arms crossed over his broad chest, posture rigid, as if bracing for a blow. Evie slowed her steps, measuring her words before speaking. "I need to know what happened to him." Caleb didn't look at her. His gaze stayed fixed on the stretch of land before them, as if somewhere beyond the rise of hills lay an answer she couldn't see. "Ain't much to tell." "I don't believe that," she said, her voice calm but unyielding. "People in town don't believe it either." That earned her a glance. His blue-gray eyes, cool as river stones, settled on her with the weight of something unreadable. "People in town like to talk." She ignored the dismissal. "They say it wasn't natural." Caleb exhaled, shifting his weight. "They say a lot of things." Evie's fingers curled into the fabric of her skirt. "I need to know how he died." His jaw tightened. "He was found out past the river. Nobody saw what happened. Did you?" She pressed. His gaze sharpened, and something unspoken stretched between them, thick and uneasy. "If I had, we wouldn't be having this conversation." Evie swallowed, her throat dry as dust. She wanted to believe him. But there was something in his tone, something guarded, that told her he wasn't giving her everything. "When did you last see him?" A muscle in his jaw twitched. "Couple days before." "And he didn't mention anything?" "Nothing about land." "About Miss Hartley?" Caleb interrupted, his tone edged with impatience. "Whatever you think you're going to find, I'd advise you to let it be." Let it be, her stomach twisted. She had lost Tommy before she ever had the chance to know him properly, and now the only person who might have answers was standing in front of her, telling her to look away. "I can't do that," she said quietly. Caleb's lips pressed into a firm line. His gaze flicked toward the cemetery, lingering there a long moment before returning to her. "Tommy wrote you." The change in subject threw her. Yes, he considered that. "And he asked you to come?" Evie lifted her chin. "He wanted a future. With me." Something passed through his expression, quick but unmistakable. Regret. Or maybe it was something deeper, something tangled in the past he wasn't ready to unravel. "He was a good man," Caleb said at last. The words sat heavy in the space between them. Evie felt a prickling in her chest. This was the first truth Caleb had given her without caution or hesitation. Whatever else he wasn't saying, she believed that. They stood there for a long moment, neither one speaking. The wind stirred again, rustling through the dry grass, filling the silence with something restless and unfinished. Finally, Caleb shifted. "You shouldn't be out here alone." She studied him, searching for any crack in his composure. "And yet, you are." that earned her something almost like a smile, but it was gone before it fully formed. He shook his head, stepping past her, moving toward town with a gait that spoke of a man who carried more than just his own burdens. Evie watched him go, the weight of his words settling deep. She might not trust him, but she wasn't ready to turn away from him, either. Act 2. Whispers in the Dust. The midday sun hung high over Red Mesa, beating down on the town with the kind of relentless heat that made a person long for shade and a sip of cool water. Dust rose in lazy swirls with every footstep, settling into the cracks of wooden boardwalks and clinging to the hems of skirts. Evie adjusted her hat and stepped off the walkway, determination setting her spine straight as she made her way toward the saloon. She had spent too long reeling from shock, too long letting grief take the reins. No more. Tommy deserved better than silence. Inside, the saloon smelled of spilled whiskey and sweat, the air thick with pipe smoke. Light streamed through the dirt-streaked windows, catching on the floating motes that never quite settled. A piano rested in the corner, its keys untouched for now, while a handful of men hunched over their drinks at tables worn smooth from years of use. Conversations dulled as she stepped inside, a few wary glances cast her way before men returned to their cups. It was no place for a lady, and they knew it. She knew it too, but she didn't care. The bartender, a heavy-set man with thinning hair, wiped at a glass with a rag that looked no cleaner than the floorboards. His gaze met hers, assessing but not unkind. "Something I can do for you, miss?" Evie rested her hands against the wooden counter. "I'm looking for information about Tommy McAllister." The bartender hesitated. One of the men at a nearby table cleared his throat and shifted in his seat. Evie turned, catching his weathered features, a man who had seen too many years in the sun. His skin creased like old leather, his eyes sharp beneath the wide brim of his hat. "Ain't a name folks are keen on bringing up these days," the old prospector said, his voice rough like sand scraping against rock. Evie met his gaze head on. "And why is that?" He leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping idly against the rim of his tin cup. "'Cause men who dig too deep in the wrong dirt tend to find themselves buried in it." A chill curled along her spine, but she refused to let it show. "Meaning?" The old man studied her for a long moment, as if weighing whether she was worth the trouble. Then he sighed and scratched at his stubbled chin. "Your fella wasn't just settling here to raise cattle and build a house. He was looking for something. Something folks in power didn't want found." Her throat tightened. "Land. More than land." He lifted his cup to his lips, taking a slow sip before adding water. Evie frowned. "Water?" The bartender made a quiet sound, half warning, half agreement, but he didn't interrupt. The prospector set his tin down with a dull thunk. "Wyoming's got land far as the eye can see, but it's water that keeps a town alive." "And Tommy?" He had his hands on maps, deeds, whispers of rights that some folks figured weren't rightly his. Evie's pulse quickened. "Are you saying someone killed him for it?" The saloon hushed at her question. The old man didn't answer right away. He just watched her, those sharp eyes measuring, before he finally muttered, "I'm saying men have killed for less." The bartender coughed into his fist and shifted his weight. "Miss Hartley," he said in a low voice, "sometimes it's best not to go digging in another man's grave." Evie lifted her chin. "And sometimes it's the only way to find the truth." The old prospector's eyes glimmered with something, respect, maybe, or pity. She wasn't sure which. She nodded once, turned on her heel, and strode for the door, leaving the weight of their warning behind. The heat had begun to ease as the afternoon stretched toward evening, but the streets of Red Mesa held on to the day's warmth like an ember that refused to burn out. Evie made her way past the general store and toward the livery, her thoughts tangled with what she had learned. If Tommy had uncovered something important, something dangerous, who else had known? And who had been desperate enough to silence him? The unease of the townsfolk, the half-answers, the warning in their voices, it all wove together into a thread she couldn't ignore. She was so lost in thought that she almost didn't notice him. But Caleb McAllister had a way of making his presence known, even when he wasn't trying to. He stood near the edge of the street, half in shadow, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Arms crossed, jaw set, eyes narrowed just enough to tell her he didn't like what she was up to. She met his gaze, her pulse steady. He said nothing. Neither did she. But something passed between them. Something unspoken yet heavy. He knew. Maybe not everything, maybe not the details, but he knew she was looking, that she wasn't backing down. A part of her expected him to cross the street, to say something, to warn her off like the others had. But he didn't. Instead, he held her gaze for one long, stretched-out moment before turning and walking away. Evie watched him go, a fresh resolve hardening in her chest. She wasn't leaving Red Mesa. Not until she uncovered what Tommy had died for, and not even Caleb McAllister's warning glare would stop her from finding out the truth. The wind had died by the time Evie reached the outskirts of Red Mesa, leaving the land wrapped in an eerie hush. The trail leading toward the abandoned ranch was uneven, cracked earth stretching under the dull glow of an early evening sky. Scrub brush dotted the land, their twisted limbs reaching toward a sun that had baked them dry. A pair of hawks circled high above, casting shadows that drifted across the hard-packed dirt, their silence more unsettling than any sound. She wasn't sure what she expected to find here, only that something about this place set her nerves on edge. Tommy had been seen out this way talking to someone. The details had been sparse, the whispers reluctant. But the way the townsfolk had looked away when she asked, the way their voices had tightened just enough to betray unease, told her this place held more than just dust and abandoned dreams. The ranch itself stood at the base of a shallow hill, its once proud frame slumped in places where time had gnawed away at the wood. The fence that had once marked the property's edge had long since crumbled, the posts nothing more than brittle remnants. The windows were empty, hollowed-out sockets that stared blankly at the open land. A horse whinnied in the distance, the sound sharp against the stillness. Evie's fingers tightened around the strap of her satchel. She had no business being here alone. And yet, something pulled her forward. Her steps were careful, boots pressing into dry earth as she approached the porch. The floorboards creaked under her weight, the sound breaking the hush like a gunshot. She hesitated, her pulse a steady drum in her ears, then reached for the door. It wasn't locked. She pushed it open slowly, the rusted hinges groaning in protest. Inside, dust coated every surface. A single wooden chair lay overturned near the fireplace, its legs snapped like a broken limb. Torn curtains hung in tattered strips, their fabric swaying slightly in the draught, seeping through the cracked walls. The scent of dry rot lingered, heavy and stale. This place had been left in a hurry. Something about that sent a chill through her. She took another step, scanning the shadows, looking for any sign of the sound of footsteps behind her made her freeze. A heartbeat later, she knew. She wasn't alone. Evie barely had time to turn before rough hands grabbed her. A sharp cry left her lips as she was yanked backward, her breath stolen by the sudden, jarring movement. Boots scraped against the wooden floor, the scuffle loud in the emptiness of the house. "Shouldn't be here, lady," a low voice rasped in her ear. She twisted, trying to free herself, but the grip on her arms tightened. Another man stepped into view from the shadows, his face half hidden beneath the brim of a sweat-stained hat. He was older, with a grizzled beard and a gaze that sent a warning skittering down her spine. "Didn't anyone tell you asking questions gets folks in trouble?" Evie's pulse pounded. She had no weapon, no way to fight off two men who outweighed her by half again. The older one stepped closer, slow and measured, as if he had all the time in the world. "You ain't got a reason to be out here. Maybe we ought to teach you why." A third man moved in from the doorway, blocking the exit. Panic clawed at her throat. Then, all at once, the tension in the air shattered. The crack of gunfire split through the night. The man holding her jerked, his grip loosening just enough for Evie to wrench free. She stumbled forward, gasping for breath, just as a shadow moved through the doorway with controlled precision. Caleb. He moved like a man who had been in trouble before, calm, sure, his gun steady in his grip. "Let her go," he said, his voice cutting through the air like steel. The man who had been holding her cursed, reaching for his own weapon. Caleb fired again. The bullet hit the ground near the man's feet, kicking up dirt and sending him scrambling backward. The message was clear. "You got 3 seconds to disappear," Caleb said, voice low, lethal. "If you're still standing here after that, I put you in the ground." The men hesitated, their gazes darting between Evie and Caleb. Then, as if reaching the same decision all at once, they turned and ran. The dust hadn't even settled before Caleb turned on her. "Are you out of your damn mind?" Evie straightened, still catching her breath. "I had a lead." "You had a death wish," he snapped. His gun was already holstered, but the anger in his eyes hadn't cooled. "What the hell were you thinking, coming out here alone?" Evie squared her shoulders. "I was thinking Tommy was murdered, and no one else seems to care." Something dark passed over his face at that. He raked a hand through his hair, exhaling hard. "You don't belong in the middle of this, Evie." "Neither did Tommy," she shot back. Caleb went silent. The wind stirred between them, carrying the scent of sage and dust. "You could have been hurt," he finally said, quieter this time. "But I wasn't." "Because I was here," he said, his voice rough. She didn't argue. Because he was right. She had been outmatched, unprepared. And if Caleb hadn't shown up when he did, she didn't want to think about what could have happened. For the first time since arriving in Red Mesa, fear curled its way into her determination. But it didn't erase her resolve. She met Caleb's gaze, something unspoken settling between them. "Tell me what you know," she said. His jaw tightened, as if he wanted to refuse her. But after a moment, something shifted in his stance. "Come on," he muttered, turning toward the horses tied outside. "If you're going to get yourself killed, you might as well know why." Evie followed, knowing this was the closest thing to trust she was going to get from Caleb McAllister. For now. The fire burned low, its glow casting long shadows across the dry earth. The night air held a sharpness that hadn't been there earlier, the Wyoming wind whispering through the brittle grass. Overhead, the sky stretched wide and endless, stars scattered like crushed diamonds against the inky black. Evie sat close to the fire, the warmth pressing against her front while the cold nipped at her back. She pulled her shawl tighter, but it did little to chase away the chill that had settled in her bones, not from the night air, but from the reality of what she had nearly stumbled into that afternoon. Across from her, Caleb sat with his back against a rock, arms resting on his bent knees. He had been quiet since they left the ranch, since the men who had ambushed her disappeared into the night. But then, he was always quiet. A man who measured his words the way others measured the weight of their bullets carefully, never wasting one unless it mattered. She studied him in the firelight, noting the hard line of his jaw, the tension that hadn't left his shoulders. He was angry, maybe at her, maybe at himself. Maybe at Tommy for leaving them in this mess to begin with. "How long are you going to sit there brooding?" she asked, breaking the silence. His gaze lifted to hers, unreadable in the dim light. "You could have been killed today. I know that. You say it like it don't mean much." His tone was sharp, edged with something more than just irritation. She swallowed, watching the fire pop and shift as the wood crackled. "It means plenty. But so does finding out what really happened to Tommy." His jaw ticked. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "You think knowing will change anything?" "I think it'll mean something," she said, her voice quieter now. "To me, to you, to him." A muscle worked in his cheek, and for a long moment he didn't speak. Then he let out a slow breath, shaking his head. Tommy always thought he could fix things. Thought he could make something good out of a place like this. Evie swallowed past the lump in her throat. "He wrote me about that. About the land, about how he wanted to build something lasting." Caleb's mouth pulled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "That sounds like him." He reached for a small branch near his boot and snapped it between his fingers. He had a way of making people believe in things. even when they shouldn't, she frowned. You think he was wrong? His gaze lifted to hers, the firelight catching the blue in his eyes. I think he trusted the wrong people. Something about the way he said it sent a chill through her. There was more he wasn't saying, more he was holding back. She hesitated before asking, was it you? He stiffened. What? Did he trust you? His fingers tightened around the stick in his hand before he tossed it into the fire. Tommy thought I'd always be there to pull him out of trouble. His voice was rough now, as if the words scraped against something raw inside him. He thought I'd fix the messes he didn't see coming. Evie's heart ached at the guilt in his tone. And this time you couldn't. Caleb exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. This time I was too late. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the crackling of the fire and the distant sound of the wind moving through the grass. Evie pulled her knees up, wrapping her arms around them. I didn't know him the way you did, she admitted, but he gave me hope. That has to count for something. Caleb's gaze lingered on her for a long moment before he nodded once. Yeah, it does. And just like that, something shifted between them. Not trust. Not yet. But something close. Dawn stretched over the plains in streaks of pale gold and pink, chasing away the cold of the night. The fire had long since died, leaving only a bed of embers in its wake. Evie stood at the edge of camp, staring out toward the horizon. The events of the previous day sat heavy in her mind, but so did something else, a feeling, an instinct that wouldn't let her rest. You sure about this? Caleb's voice came from behind her. She turned to find him adjusting the saddle on his horse, his movements practiced, efficient. As sure as I can be, she said. He didn't look convinced, but he didn't argue. Town's been whispering about this place for a while. If something's there, it won't be good. Then we'll find out together, she said, surprising herself with how much she meant it. Caleb gave her a long look before nodding. Let's go. The safe house wasn't far, just outside of town, nestled between the hills where the land dipped into a dry gulch. The structure was barely standing, the roof sagging in places, the front door hanging on its hinges. It looked abandoned, but Evie had learned that looks meant little in Red Mesa. They dismounted, tying their horses a few yards away before stepping inside. The air smelled of dust and decay. Papers were scattered across the floor, their edges curled and yellowed with time. A table stood in the center of the room, its surface covered in maps, some torn, others weighed down by empty bottles. Evie moved toward them, her pulse kicking up as she scanned the markings. These are land deeds, she said, fingers tracing the ink. Tommy must have been looking into something big. Caleb picked up one of the papers, his brow furrowing. Water rights, he muttered. He wasn't just buying land. He was trying to control what ran through it. Evie looked up at him. Why would someone kill him for that? Caleb's expression darkened. Because water out here means power. If Tommy was close to proving who had legal claim over these resources, he was a threat. A cold shiver ran down her spine. And whoever killed him isn't done yet. Caleb's gaze met hers, steady and unwavering. No, they're not. For the first time, Evie realized just how deep this went. This wasn't just about Tommy anymore. This was about Red Mesa itself. She swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the map. Then we need to find out who's behind it, she said. Caleb nodded. And fast. As they stepped outside, the sun had risen fully over the horizon, casting long shadows over the land. Whatever they had uncovered, it had already cost Tommy his life. And now it had tied Evie and Caleb together in a way neither of them could walk away from. The town hall smelled of ink, old paper, and the sweat of men who had spent too many years making decisions behind closed doors. The wooden beams groaned overhead, settling under the weight of time, while dim lamplight cast long shadows against the walls. Evie stood beside Caleb, her pulse steady but strong as she faced the man sitting at the broad oak desk. Henry Tasker. The man who had, for the past decade, held more influence over Red Mesa than the law itself. He wasn't the sheriff, nor the mayor, but a man with power that stretched into places where rules didn't hold weight. Tasker leaned back in his chair, his thick fingers drumming lazily against the desktop. He looked comfortable, almost amused, the way a cat might when watching a mouse scurry in the wrong direction. "You've got some nerve, Miss Hartley," he said, his voice smooth, practiced. His dark eyes slid to Caleb. "And you, McAllister? I'd have thought you'd know better." Caleb didn't move, his stance as unyielding as the land outside. "I don't take kindly to men who hide behind ledgers and big words." Tasker smirked, shifting slightly. But Evie didn't miss the way his hand drifted toward the drawer at his right. A gun, maybe. A stack of documents he didn't want them to see. Either way, it told her he wasn't as unaffected as he wanted them to believe. "You think you found something," Tasker continued, his tone still lazy, but there was a new edge to it now. "Some great truth that'll shake this town to its core. But let me tell you something, little lady." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes pinning her in place. Tommy McAllister was a fool who thought he could play in a game too big for him. And now he's 6 feet under because of it. You'd do well to keep your pretty nose out of things that don't concern you. Evie felt the sting of his words, the callous way he dismissed Tommy's life, but she held her ground. "If what he knew didn't matter, you wouldn't be trying so hard to scare us off." Tasker's smirk faded just a fraction. "You don't know what you're talking about, Miss Hartley." Caleb stepped closer, his voice calm but firm. "Why don't you enlighten us?" Tasker exhaled a slow breath, as if suddenly weary of the conversation. "Let me give you both a word of advice. Walk away while you still can." The room stretched with silence. Then, in a move almost too quick to follow, Tasker's hand darted to the drawer. Caleb moved faster. With a sharp scrape of wood, he reached across the desk, grabbed Tasker's wrist, and slammed it down. The older man let out a curse, his face twisting with fury, but Caleb didn't let go. "You think I don't see what you are?" Caleb's voice was low, controlled. "A man so used to pulling strings that you forgot what it's like when someone pulls back?" Tasker's eyes burned with anger, but he forced a thin smile. "You're making a mistake, McAllister." Caleb let go, and Tasker jerked his arm back, rubbing at his wrist. Evie took a breath. Tommy didn't deserve what happened to him, and neither do the people of this town. Tasker leaned forward, his tone a whisper of menace. "The people of this town don't care, Miss Hartley. They know better than to go against men who hold the land, the water, and the law in their pockets." He straightened, smoothing a hand over his vest. "You and McAllister? You're nothing more than dust in the wind." A chill crawled up Evie's spine, but she refused to let him see it. Caleb's hand landed at her elbow. "Come on," he said, voice tight. "We're done here." But the second they turned for the door, a deep voice rang out. "Not so fast." Evie's breath hitched. 2 men stepped into the room, both broad-shouldered and sharp-eyed, hired guns. Caleb stiffened. They had walked right into a trap. Evie had a half-second to react before Caleb grabbed her wrist and yanked her behind him. The first man reached for his gun. Caleb moved like a snake striking, his fist slamming into the man's jaw before the weapon cleared its holster. A sharp crack echoed through the room as the man stumbled back, colliding with the desk. "Run," Caleb ordered, his voice edged with urgency. Evie didn't hesitate. She darted for the side door just as the second man lunged. A rough hand snatched the back of her dress, yanking her off balance, but she twisted sharply, bringing her elbow up with all her strength. The impact sent pain shooting through her arm, but it worked. The man grunted, his grip loosening just enough for her to break free. Caleb was already at her side, one strong hand grabbing hers as they bolted down the narrow corridor leading out of the hall. Boots thundered behind them. "Left," Caleb barked. They tore around a corner, feet pounding against the worn floorboards. Ahead, the dim glow of an oil lamp cast jagged shadows along the walls. The door at the end of the hall loomed closer, but the sound of pursuit was too close. Caleb shoved Evie ahead. "Go!" She burst through the door, stumbling onto the wooden porch. The cool night air hit her lungs just as Caleb slammed the door shut behind them. "Move," he said, his grip firm on her hand. They ran, past the post office, past the dimly lit storefronts, into the shadows between buildings. The town was quiet, save for the sound of their ragged breaths and the echo of their footfalls. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Caleb pulled them into an alley behind the livery. He pressed Evie against the wall, his chest rising and falling hard as he listened for pursuit. Silence. Evie's breath came in gasps, her pulse hammering. She met Caleb's gaze, his face shadowed but intense. "Are they following us?" she whispered. Caleb shook his head, still listening. Not yet. The weight of what had just happened pressed in around them. Tasker was involved. That much was clear. And whatever Tommy had uncovered had been dangerous enough that men were willing to kill to keep it buried. Evie shivered, though not from the cold. Caleb's hand brushed against her arm, gentle, steady. "We're in this now," he said, his voice low. She looked up at him, knowing he was right. There was no walking away. Whatever truth lay buried in Red Mesa, they were going to find it. Together. The trail wound deep into the wilderness, where the land stretched raw and untouched. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting a golden haze over the scrub and jagged rock formations. The only sound was the occasional cry of a hawk circling high above and the soft crunch of hooves against the dry earth. Evie shifted in her saddle, scanning the landscape. The deeper they rode, the more certain she became that this place hadn't been touched in some time. No wagon ruts marred the hard-packed dirt. No ranchers had driven cattle through. It was as if the land had been forgotten. Beside her, Caleb guided his horse with easy precision, his gaze keen as he scanned ahead. "This is where Tommy was headed," he said, more to himself than her. "How do you know?" He nodded toward a break in the hills ahead. "It's the only place a man could hide something worth finding." A prickle of unease crawled up her spine as they approached the ravine. The hills narrowed into a tight pass, and then the land opened into a small basin, where the remains of a mining camp lay abandoned. The place looked untouched for years. Old cabins leaned on broken beams, their roofs caved in, walls rotting. A collapsed wooden shaft stood in the center of the camp, the rusted remnants of mining equipment scattered around it. Time had stilled everything, as if the men who once worked here had simply vanished into the dust. Evie slid off her horse, tying the reins to a gnarled post that might have once been part of a fence. She moved cautiously, feeling the weight of silence pressing down on the camp. "Whatever was here," she said softly, "someone wanted it buried." Caleb dismounted beside her, which means it was valuable. She glanced at him, then stepped toward one of the cabins, careful where she placed her boots. The door hung open, creaking when she pushed it aside. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of decay and dry wood. Papers littered the floor, yellowed and brittle, curling from years of neglect. Caleb crouched near a toppled desk, rifling through a pile of scattered documents. "These aren't mining logs," he muttered, lifting a worn leather-bound book. Evie stepped closer. "What is it?" He handed it to her, and she flipped through the pages, her breath catching at the careful script. Not just ledgers, names, dates, transactions, Tommy's handwriting. She traced her fingers over the ink. "He was keeping records," she whispered, trying to prove something. Caleb took the book from her and studied the entries. "Water rights," he said grimly, "and mineral claims." He flipped a page, frowning. "Looks like some of these were bought up in secret. Others," he shook his head, "they were stolen." Evie's heartbeat quickened. "Stolen." Caleb exhaled. "From ranchers. From homesteaders. Folks who didn't know they were sitting on something worth taking." He turned another page. "Tasker's name is all over this." Her stomach twisted. So Tommy found proof. Enough to ruin Tasker and anyone working with him. Caleb's expression was grim as he snapped the book shut. Which means someone was willing to kill to make sure he never used it. A cold shiver worked through her. She had suspected Tommy had uncovered something dangerous, but seeing it laid out like this, his careful notes, his determined script, made it real. "We need to get this out of here," Caleb said, slipping the ledger into his saddlebag. Before someone figures out we found it. Evie nodded, a new sense of urgency threading through her. The men who had killed Tommy weren't just murderers. They were thieves. And now that she knew the truth, she wasn't about to walk away. They camped a few miles from the mining camp, where a small clearing tucked between the hills offered shelter. The fire crackled steadily, sending trails of smoke into the cool night air. Overhead, the sky stretched wide and infinite, the stars shining with the kind of brightness only found in the deepest reaches of the frontier. Evie wrapped her arms around her knees, staring into the flames. The weight of what they had found pressed against her ribs, heavy and relentless. "You should take the ledger and go," Caleb said, breaking the quiet. She turned to him, startled. "What?" He leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. "Take it and leave Red Mesa. Get as far away as you can," she frowned. "And let them keep doing this." His gaze met hers, unreadable in the dim firelight. "They won't stop, Evie." "Neither will I," she wanted to say. But instead, she studied him. The hard set of his jaw, the tension in his shoulders. He wasn't just worried about her. He was blaming himself. "This isn't your fault," she said softly. Caleb exhaled, shaking his head. "Tommy came to me before he died, told me he'd found something worth fighting for." He looked away, his hands tightening into fists. "I didn't listen." She swallowed against the ache in her throat. "You couldn't have known." He let out a humorless chuckle. "That's the thing, Evie. I did know. I knew Tasker was a bastard. I knew he had men working for him who did his bidding without question. But Tommy wanted to believe in the law. In doing things right." His voice dropped lower. "I should have protected him." Evie reached across the space between them, her fingers brushing against his hand. "You're trying to now," she said. Caleb didn't pull away. For a long moment they sat in silence, the warmth of the fire casting long shadows across the ground. "You still have time," she added, "to do right by him." He turned his hand over, his fingers closing around hers, rough and warm. "You should leave," he said again, though his voice had lost its edge. "I won't," she whispered. His thumb traced absently along her knuckles. "You're too stubborn for your own good," she smiled, just a little. "And you're too used to carrying everything alone." He didn't argue. Instead, his grip on her hand tightened, as if he was anchoring himself to something solid. "We can't go up against Tasker alone." "No," she agreed. "But we won't be alone. If we can get this to the right people who aren't bought, we can stop him." Caleb nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. But for the first time she sensed something new in him. Not just guilt, not just regret, resolve. As the fire crackled between them, as the stars stretched high overhead, they sat together in the quiet, bound not just by loss, but by something stronger. A promise. They weren't walking away, and they weren't backing down. Red Mesa looked different in the cold light of morning, though nothing had physically changed. The same dust-streaked buildings stood in weary defiance of time, the same wooden sidewalks groaned under the weight of passing boots, and the same men in high places still held the reins of power. But now Evie saw it for what it was, a town caught in the grip of corruption, its people too worn down or too afraid to fight back. That was about to change. She and Caleb moved carefully through the streets, their expressions neutral, their words guarded. The ledger, Tommy's proof of stolen land and manipulated water rights, was tucked safely inside Caleb's saddlebag. But knowledge alone wasn't enough. They needed men willing to stand against Tasker and his ilk. Their first stop was Jonas Tate, a former outlaw turned livery owner. He leaned against a post outside his stable, arms crossed, eyes sharp with a wariness that never quite left him. His dark hair had streaks of silver, and the lines on his face spoke of a man who had seen too much and survived anyway. "You must think I got a death wish," Jonas said when Caleb laid out the situation. "You know better than anyone what Tasker's done to this town," Caleb answered. "He runs everything, owns half the men, and the ones he can't own, he breaks." Jonas let out a humorless chuckle. "And you two are looking to be the ones who break him." Evie stepped forward. "We have proof, Jonas. We can take it to the circuit judge. But we need help getting it there." Jonas studied her for a long moment, then sighed. "Tommy was a fool," he muttered, "but he had guts. I respected that." He flicked a glance at Caleb. "You willing to see this through?" Caleb nodded once. Jonas exhaled, pushing off the post. "Then I reckon I am too. One down." Next, they found Samuel Keene, a rancher who had once owned a thriving spread until Tasker's men dammed up his water supply, forcing him to sell off most of his land to survive. He greeted them with suspicion, but when Caleb showed him Tommy's notes, detailing exactly how Tasker had maneuvered the land grab, the hardened lines on the rancher's face turned to something darker. That son of a Samuel stopped himself, his jaw tightening. "You have a plan?" "We're working on it," Caleb said. "Then count me in." Their last stop was Sheriff Eli Ward, the only lawman in town who still held to any sense of justice. "You know what you're asking me to do," Eli said, leaning back in his chair, arms crossed over his chest. His badge was dusty, but not tarnished. "You're the law," Evie said simply. "Isn't this what you swore to stand against?" Eli let out a breath, running a hand down his face. "It's not that simple. Tasker's got men everywhere." "Then we bring more men," Caleb said. Silence stretched. Then Eli stood, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "If we're doing this," he said, fastening his gun belt, "then we're doing it tonight." A plan formed in the dim back room of the saloon, where shadows clung to the walls and voices remained low. They mapped routes, arranged signals, laid out contingencies. For the first time in a long while, Red Mesa felt something it hadn't in years. Hope. By late afternoon, they were riding out. The land stretched wide before them, dry and endless, a world painted in muted browns and reds. Caleb rode ahead, leading the way toward an outpost nestled in a rocky canyon, just outside of town, a known meeting point for Tasker's men. If they were going to strike, it had to be there. Evie rode beside him, stealing a glance at the others following behind. Jonas had his rifle strapped to his saddle, his easy posture betraying none of the danger they rode toward. Samuel's jaw was set with quiet fury, and Eli looked every bit the lawman he was meant to be. The weight of what they were about to do pressed against them, heavy and unshakable. Jonas broke the silence. "You ever run headfirst into certain death before?" "Can't say I have," Samuel muttered. Eli let out a breath. "No, but I've arrested a few fools who have." Jonas grinned. "Well, ain't that reassuring?" Evie shook her head, but the warmth in her chest was unexpected. They were heading into a fight they might not walk away from. And yet there was a bond forming here, forged in the fire of necessity. As they neared the canyon, Caleb slowed his horse, turning to look at her. "You sure about this?" She met his gaze, steady. "Are you?" A muscle ticked in his jaw, but he nodded. "Yeah." Evie tightened her hold on the reins. "Then let's finish what Tommy started." The canyon loomed ahead, its jagged cliffs casting deep shadows over the trail. Somewhere in that darkness, their enemy waited. The time for running was over. This was the reckoning. The moon hung high, casting a silver sheen over the rugged terrain, its glow doing little to soften the jagged edges of the outpost ahead. The camp sat nestled in a rocky basin, its perimeter lined with broken-down shacks and rusting mining equipment, relics of an industry long abandoned. Shadows stretched across the dirt-packed ground, the occasional lamplight seeping through the cracks of buildings, offering just enough illumination to see the figures moving within. The air was thick with tension. Evie crouched behind a boulder, her heartbeat pounding against her ribs. From their vantage point above the camp, she could see men clustered near the largest structure, a long, squat building with boarded-up windows. That was where Tasker's men were holed up, likely drinking, scheming, and completely unaware that their time was running out. Jonas shifted beside her, checking the rounds in his revolver. "Been a long time since I took on a fight that wasn't mine." His voice was low, but steady. "This one's yours now," Caleb said, his eyes never leaving the outpost. Jonas gave a dry chuckle. "Guess it is." Sheriff Eli Ward knelt a few feet away, adjusting his rifle. "They won't go down easy," he muttered. "Men like Tasker never do." Evie took a slow breath. "Then we make sure they don't get the chance to fight back." A single nod passed between them. Caleb raised his hand, signaling the others to move into position. Samuel Keene and the handful of ranchers who had joined them spread out along the ridge, weapons drawn. The wind picked up, kicking loose dust into the air, but it wasn't enough to mask the sound of their boots shifting against dry earth. Then the stillness shattered. A gunshot rang out. For a split second, silence followed, like the world itself had taken a sharp breath. Then all hell broke loose. Men shouted from inside the camp. Boots thundered against wooden porches. The glow of lanterns bobbed wildly as Tasker's men scrambled to react. Caleb fired first, taking down the lookout near the gate before he could raise the alarm. Jonas and Ely followed, their shots precise, forcing the men inside to duck for cover. Evie's pulse roared in her ears as she moved in alongside them, her revolver cold in her grip. The acrid scent of gunpowder filled the air. Wood splintered as bullets punched through doors and windows. Someone inside screamed, the sound guttural and panicked. She pressed herself against the side of a shack, breathing hard. Across the clearing, Caleb was already advancing, his movements quick and efficient, driving Tasker's men back toward the center of camp. They were winning, but it wasn't over yet. The fight surged through the camp like wildfire. Men ducked between buildings, returning fire, their shots ringing off metal and kicking up dirt. Smoke curled through the night air, the lanterns swinging wildly as chaos unfolded. Evie pressed forward, keeping low as she ran between two buildings. A shadow moved ahead, one of Tasker's men, raising his gun toward Jonas. She didn't think. Lifting her revolver, she fired. The man crumpled, his weapon clattering to the ground. Jonas turned, eyes wide, before nodding once in thanks. Evie barely had time to catch her breath before another figure lunged at her from the darkness. A strong arm hooked around her waist, yanking her backward. Her gun was knocked from her grip, landing in the dust a few feet away. She gasped, struggling against the iron hold. "Should have stayed out of it, lady," a voice growled in her ear. "Tasker's man, one of his thugs." Evie twisted sharply, slamming her heel down onto his boot. The man cursed, his grip loosening just enough for her to break free. She spun, reaching for the knife she had tucked into her boot, but before she could grab it, a gunshot rang out. Her attacker stiffened, eyes going wide. Then he dropped. Caleb stood a few yards away, his gun still raised. His jaw was tight, his breathing ragged. "You all right?" Evie swallowed hard, nodding. "Get your gun," he ordered. She bent quickly, retrieving her revolver, then turned back to Caleb. "We have to end this." A yell cut through the night. "They're in the warehouse!" Tasker. Caleb and Evie exchanged a look before moving. They reached the large structure, its heavy doors hanging half open. Inside, lanterns cast a dim, flickering light across crates, barrels and stacks of old mining tools. The scent of damp wood and oil filled the air. Tasker stood near the back, a gun in one hand, the ledger in the other. His expression twisted with rage. "You stupid, stubborn fools," he spat. "You should have run when you had the chance," Caleb said coldly. Tasker laughed, shaking his head. "You think this changes anything? You think people in this town will care?" Eli stepped forward, gun aimed steady. "You stole from them, Tasker. Took their land, their water. That ledger's got all the proof we need." Tasker's eyes flicked toward the doorway, as if weighing his options. Caleb saw it. "Don't even think about it." For a moment it seemed Tasker might try to shoot his way out. But then Jonas stepped up, his rifle leveled at Tasker's chest. "Don't be stupid, Henry." The fight left Tasker's eyes. His shoulders sagged just a fraction. It was over. Evie let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Outside, the gunfire had died down. Tasker's men had either surrendered or fled. The camp was littered with spent shells and broken crates, the air thick with the smell of smoke. Caleb exhaled, lowering his gun. For a long moment there was only silence. Then, Slowly, Evie met his gaze. They had done it. Justice had come to Red Mesa at last. Act 3. Aftermath and Reckoning. The first light of dawn crept over the hills, turning the wreckage of the mining camp into a tableau of smoke and dust. The battle had been won, but the air still carried the acrid scent of gunpowder, mingling with the earth and sweat of men who had fought for something greater than themselves. Evie stepped carefully over the uneven ground, her skirts brushing against scattered debris, broken crates, spent shells, the remains of a fire still smoldering from the night before. Around her, the men who had stood by her and Caleb worked in quiet determination, tending to the wounded, binding up injuries with whatever cloth they had, wiping dirt and blood from tired faces. She caught sight of Jonas crouched near a fallen man, his hand steady as he wrapped a strip of cloth around a gunshot wound. The outlaw turned alley had a hardened look about him, but when he glanced up at her, something in his expression softened. "We lost 2, he said, voice rough with exhaustion. "But we took down more of theirs." Evie swallowed the lump in her throat. They had known the cost of this fight, but seeing it laid out before her made the weight of it settle heavy on her chest. A few yards away, Samuel Keene stood with a group of ranchers, surveying the wreckage. The lines of worry carved into his face seemed deeper now, but there was something else there to resolve. "We'll have to get word to the circuit judge," Eli said from behind her, his voice low. The sheriff had taken a bullet to the shoulder but was still standing, still moving. That ledger's enough to put Tasker and his men away for good. Caleb approached, his hands smudged with dirt and blood, his jaw tight. "What about the ones who ran?" Eli met his gaze. "We'll find them. But Tasker's done. His men won't be so bold without him giving orders." A hush settled over them then, a shared understanding that, while this fight was over, the work of rebuilding had only begun. Evie let out a slow breath, her gaze drifting toward the horizon. Red Mesa had been held in the grip of corruption for too long. But now there was a chance for something different. The town was stirring. Word would spread, and soon people would know they had won. By late afternoon, Red Mesa gathered at the town hall. The room, once a place where power had been wielded like a weapon, now held something else entirely: justice. The scent of freshly cut wood filled the air. Someone had taken the time to repair the broken benches, to wipe away the grime that had settled in the corners. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting golden beams across the assembled crowd. Evie sat near the front, her hands clasped in her lap. Beside her, Caleb leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his expression unreadable as Ailey stood before the gathered townsfolk. "Tasker's reign over this town is finished," the sheriff said, his voice carrying through the hall. "Evidence of his crimes is being sent to the circuit judge. The land he stole will be returned, and the water rights will be restored." He looked over the crowd. Red Mesa belongs to its people again. A ripple of hushed voices swept through the room, cautious but hopeful. Some faces were wary after years of corruption. Trust wouldn't come easy. But others sat taller, their eyes bright with something long absent. Hope? Evie scanned the crowd, recognizing those who had fought beside them. Jonas, his arms crossed as he nodded approvingly. Samuel, his face lined with exhaustion but satisfaction in his gaze. There were ranchers, shopkeepers, families who had lost land, and men who had been forced to stand by as Tasker's influence choked the town. One by one, voices rose. First hesitant, then stronger. It was over. Caleb exhaled beside her, his body finally relaxing after days of being wound tight as a spring. Eli raised a hand for quiet. "We're not done rebuilding," he said, his gaze sweeping the crowd. "But we'll do it together." A murmur of agreement rippled through the hall. Evie glanced at Caleb then. He was already looking at her. For the first time since this all began, there was no anger in his eyes, no guilt, no weight of the past pressing against him. There was only quiet understanding. They had fought for this town, and maybe, just maybe, they had found something worth fighting for in each other too. As the meeting drew to a close and the townsfolk began filtering out, Evie let out a slow breath. Whatever came next, they would face it, together. The cemetery sat quiet and still, the land stretching in a gentle slope toward the horizon. The morning air was cool, touched with the scent of sage and damp earth, as if the land itself had exhaled after the long night. Soft golden light spilled across the gravestones, illuminating the names carved into time-worn wood and stone. Evie stood before Tommy's grave, her hands folded, the leather-bound ledger resting against her hip. She had carried it for days, through gunfire, dust and fear, but now it felt like a burden lifted. The wooden cross marking his resting place stood firm, though the ground around it bore no flowers, no signs of visitors except the tracks her boots had left in the dirt. A knot tightened in her throat. He had died alone, fighting for something bigger than himself, and the world had moved on without him. She knelt, pressing her palm against the earth. "I came here thinking I'd find a life with you," she whispered, "and instead I found a truth that cost you yours." A gentle breeze stirred the grass. "I used to wonder if I'd ever belong anywhere." She swallowed hard, emotions thick in her throat. "But I think maybe I was meant to come to Red Mesa for more than just you. Maybe I was meant to find something else. Something I never expected." She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing deeply, grounding herself in the quiet. "You were good, Tommy. Better than this place deserved. And I promise you, your fight won't be forgotten." Her fingers traced the edges of the cross before she rose, tilting her face toward the morning sun. The warmth settled against her skin, not as an intrusion, but as a reminder. Life moved forward, even through sorrow, and so would she. The sound of boots on dirt made her turn. Caleb approached, hands tucked into his pockets, his steps slow and deliberate. He didn't speak right away, just let his gaze drift over Tommy's grave, his expression unreadable. "I figured I'd find you here," he said at last. Evie managed a small smile. It felt right to come. Caleb nodded, stepping beside her, close enough that their arms nearly brushed. He stared at the cross marking his brother's final resting place, his jaw tight. "I used to think I could always keep him safe," he murmured. "That no matter what kind of trouble Tommy got himself into, I'd be there to pull him out." He exhaled sharply. "But I wasn't. Not this time." Evie turned to him, watching as he wrestled with something deeper than grief. "You can't carry that weight forever," she said gently. His gaze met hers, a flicker of something raw in those storm-gray eyes. "I don't know how to put it down." Evie hesitated before reaching for his hand. She expected him to pull away. Caleb had spent so much time standing apart from the world, from others, but he didn't. His fingers curled around hers, strong and warm, grounding. "I think you do," she whispered. "You just have to let yourself." His grip tightened briefly before he exhaled, shaking his head. "I've spent so long blaming myself for not being enough, for not stopping this before it ever started." His voice was quiet, edged with a pain that ran deep. "I don't even know what to do now that it's over." Evie searched his face, reading the vulnerability there. "You start over," she said softly. "The same way I have to." A long silence stretched between them, the weight of everything they had been through settling in the air. Finally, Caleb reached up, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face, his touch surprisingly gentle. "And what does starting over look like for you?" She smiled then, truly smiled. "I suppose I'll figure it out as I go." Caleb studied her, something shifting in his expression. "Then maybe we figure it out together." The words held more than just promise. They held something deeper, a beginning. As the sun climbed higher over the Wyoming sky, Evie squeezed his hand once before letting go, stepping forward with renewed strength. She didn't know what the future would bring, but she wasn't afraid to meet it anymore. The sound of hammers striking nails echoed through Red Mesa, a rhythmic testament to a town reclaiming itself. The scent of fresh cut lumber mingled with dust as men worked shoulder to shoulder, reinforcing structures that had been left to decay under Tuska's rule. Women carried baskets of bread and cool water, offering quiet encouragement as they passed. Evie stood near the general store, watching as Samuel Keene helped lift a new beam into place. Sweat glistened on his brow, but he grinned as Jonas steadied the wood with a grunt. "Didn't think I'd live to see this day," Samuel said, wiping his hands on his trousers. Jonas smirked. "Didn't think I'd care much if I did." Evie couldn't help but smile. The weight that had pressed down on Red Mesa for so long had finally lifted. People moved with purpose now, their shoulders no longer hunched in quiet resignation. The saloon, once a place where Tasker's men had whispered threats over whiskey, was now filled with ranchers discussing fair land agreements. The post office, long controlled by men who intercepted letters that didn't serve their cause, was bustling with honest work again. She turned to Caleb, who stood beside her, hands resting on his hips as he surveyed the town with the same quiet intensity he always carried. He looked different now, though. Lighter, even if his expression remained serious. "We'll need to set up a council," he said, voice thoughtful. "People who can make sure this doesn't happen again." Evie nodded. "People who have a stake in keeping things right." Caleb glanced at her then, something like admiration softening his gaze. "Like you." She let out a breath, pretending to focus on the ledger in her hands, though her heartbeat was betraying her. "I was thinking more along the lines of Jonas or Samuel." Caleb shook his head. "You got the kind of mind this town needs, Evie. Someone who doesn't just fight for justice, but knows how to build something from it." Warmth curled through her chest. She had come to Red Mesa for one life and found another waiting for her instead. "I'll think about it," she said at last. Caleb gave a knowing smile. "You already have." As dusk settled over Red Mesa, lanterns swayed on strings tied between buildings, their golden glow casting soft pools of light on the packed dirt streets. Tables lined the square, covered in checkered cloths, laden with food that had once been rationed under Tasker's thumb. Laughter rippled through the crowd, mingling with the rich scent of roasted meat and warm bread. The people of Red Mesa had gathered, not just for a meal, but for something greater, a celebration of the town's rebirth. Children ran between tables, their delighted squeals breaking through conversations. A fiddler struck up a tune near the saloon steps, and soon boots tapped in rhythm, skirts swishing as couples took to the open space, dancing in easy circles. Evie stood near the edge of the crowd, watching the scene unfold with a deep sense of satisfaction. Months ago, she would never have imagined herself here. A hand brushed her elbow, warm and familiar. "They're happy," Caleb said, his voice low. She turned, finding him watching the town with the same careful gaze he always had. But now, there was something else, something softer in the way he looked at the people, at her. "They're free," she murmured, "for the first time in years." Caleb exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "It won't be easy keeping it this way." "No," Evie agreed, "but at least now they have a chance." They stood side by side as Ely stepped onto the makeshift stage at the center of the square, quiet settling over the crowd. The sheriff looked out over the people, his hat held in his hands. "We've lost good men and women," Ely began, his voice steady. "And we've suffered under the weight of corruption that nearly took this town from us. But we fought back. We reclaimed what was ours." His gaze swept the crowd. "Red Mesa will never be the same. And that's a good thing." A murmur of agreement rippled through the gathering. "To those who stood up when it would have been easier to turn away," Eli continued, lifting his glass. "To those who believed in something better, even when it felt impossible. And to those we lost along the way, we honor them by making sure this town never falls into the wrong hands again." Caleb lifted his own glass in silent tribute, and Evie followed. Around them, glasses clinked, voices raised in a toast, and a wave of warmth spread through the square. As the celebration carried on, Caleb turned to her, his voice quieter now. "What about you, Evie? You staying?" She studied him, studied the town that had changed everything for her. The answer came easy. Yes. A slow smile touched his lips. Good. They didn't need more words. The music played, the laughter continued, and in the heart of a town that had been reborn, they stood together, a new promise unspoken but understood. The future had arrived, and for the first time it was theirs to build. The town of Red Mesa had changed. Where once there had been decay, now there was renewal. New buildings stood sturdy against the open sky, their wooden beams strong, their windows glinting in the morning sun. The general store had fresh paint, the saloon had been stripped of its past sins, and the schoolhouse, one that had nearly crumbled from neglect, was being rebuilt with eager hands. Evie walked through the heart of town, her skirts brushing against the well-packed dirt road. A group of men worked to finish the new grain mill, laughter rising between hammer strokes. Women hung crisp linens outside their homes, their chatter filled with lightness she hadn't heard when she first arrived. Children dashed between buildings, their shrill laughter ringing through the air, unburdened by the past that had weighed down their parents. She let out a slow breath, absorbing the shift, the transformation. This wasn't just a town anymore, it was home. From the corner of her eye, she caught movement near the livery. Caleb stood beside Jonas and Samuel, speaking in low tones. His hat was tipped back, revealing the sun-kissed angles of his face, his expression serious yet lighter than it had once been. He had taken up the role of leader without realizing it, without asking for it, but the town trusted him, just as she did. Jonas clapped him on the shoulder before heading toward the saloon, Samuel following close behind. Caleb turned then, his gaze landing on her, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Think the town will survive without you for a while?" he asked, his voice warm. Evie crossed her arms, tilting her head. "Depends. What do you have in mind?" His eyes glinted with something unreadable, but the kind of unreadable that made her pulse quicken. "Ride with me." She didn't hesitate. A few minutes later, they were on horseback, moving through the outskirts of Red Mesa, where the land stretched wild and untamed. The wind carried the scent of sage and sun-warmed grass, the sound of hooves steady against the packed dirt. Evie glanced sideways at Caleb. They had ridden like this before on darker days, when the road ahead had been filled with uncertainty. Now, the dust rising behind them wasn't a sign of pursuit, but of motion, of moving forward. She thought back to everything that had brought them here. The discovery of Tommy's ledger, the night of gunfire and reckoning, the whispered confessions beneath the stars. She had come to Red Mesa searching for a husband. Instead, she had found herself. And perhaps something even more unexpected. They reached the ridge just as the sun began its descent. The sky stretched wide with streaks of amber and rose. From up here, Red Mesa looked small, nestled against the vast Wyoming landscape, a single thread in an endless tapestry of land and sky. Caleb dismounted first, offering a hand to help her down. She took it without hesitation, warmth radiating through her palm as her boots met the earth. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They just stood there, side by side, watching the land shift with the wind. Finally, Caleb broke the silence. "Tommy would have liked this." Evie exhaled, her gaze tracing the horizon. "He would." Caleb turned to her then, his expression softer than she'd ever seen it. "I spent so much time trying to be the one who fixed things. Thought if I carried enough weight, I could keep everything from falling apart." She studied him, waiting. His jaw flexed before he continued. "But you showed me that some things don't need fixing. They just need building." Evie's throat tightened. "And what about you, Caleb McAllister?" she asked, her voice quiet. "What do you need?" His gaze locked onto hers, steady and sure. "You." A slow smile curved her lips. The wind kicked up, swirling dust between them, but it no longer carried the weight of past mistakes or old ghosts. It carried promise. A future. Caleb reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "We start fresh," he said simply. "You and me." Evie squeezed his hand, her heart steady, sure. Together, they stood at the edge of the world, looking out over the land that had shaped them, had tested them, had nearly broken them but hadn't. The horizon stretched before them, boundless, open, a new beginning, a promise fulfilled.